So welcome to ILV, Institute for Liberal Values, September Liberal Values Lab. And so in September, we figured, there's a lot of going back to school questions and concerns. And what we're doing for our lab is we're looking at ethnic studies. And I have two amazing people with us today to discuss ethnic studies. We've got Dr. Brandy Shufutinsky with the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values, and she is a director there. And we've got Mika Hackner, who is also with the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values and is a researcher and associate there. And both of them have been looking a lot at the issue of ethnic studies and how that is entering into our classroom and actually what's wrong with it. Because, I think at first blush, and we'll get into this, what is wrong with ethnic studies? And a lot of people don't really realize there's a form of ethnic studies that we see coming into the classroom, is namely under the guise of liberated ethnic studies, which is more of a neo-Marxist agenda. And so Brandy and Mika will tell us a little bit more about that, how to prepare for it, how to recognize it when you see it in the classroom as a parent or a teacher. And we'll be taking questions from there on out. So with that, I will hand the mic over to you, Brandy. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us.
Thanks, Jen. And it's great to be here speaking about this important topic, especially as kids are going back to school and returning to the classroom. So I think when the overall question, that's been coming up very often is, what's the problem? What's the deal with ethnic studies? Why is it so controversial? And I think one of the reasons a lot of people ask that question is because in the name, it sounds like ethnic studies is the study of different ethnic groups, which sounds, pretty normal, kind of commonplace in what we would see happen in schools. Unfortunately, it is actually a misnomer. Ethnic studies is not the study of different ethnic groups. It's the study of oppression. And because it uses an oppression pedagogy or an oppression binary, it's inherently divisive and inherently political. So it attaches the idea that ethnic groups have to be divided up, and they're divided up based on a power hierarchy that is part of the theology of ethnic studies, of critical ethnic studies. It's rooted in critical theory, which holds that there, is one group of people that hold the power and they're the oppressors. And there's another group of people that are subjugated under the oppressors, who are the oppressed. And the indicators for which group someone belongs in is their racial or ethnic group, their color. So people that are or appear to be white, or having tenets of what the ideologues that go along with this pedagogy think are whiteness, get placed into the oppressor category. And people that don't hold those things to be true, or don't hold those indicators, are put into the oppressed category. And so what we end up seeing is that this idea of power is defined by things that are really commonplace and go across cultures and across ethnic groups, like being on time, or enjoying reading and writing. Those types of things are tenets of societies across the globe. There are people that enjoy those things. But in this structure, in an ethnic studies pedagogy, those things are seen as something negative. And so they're indicators, again, of somebody who would be put in the oppressor class. I think one of the other things to highlight when you look at ethnic studies is, if we look at the world that way, that any real or perceived element of success is something inherently negative, because the only way one could have achieved that success is through exploitation, then it kind of leaves students with this idea of, well, why try? If I do try to succeed, if I do study, if I do try to do better, then I'm participating in the oppressor ideology. And that's what's happening as far as ethnic studies moving from academia into K-12. I think that we saw some of these issues come up. We're actually, unfortunately, still seeing them come up very often in California, where ethnic studies is now a high school graduation requirement for all public high school and charter high school students. And a lot of private schools are also adopting it as part of their core curriculum. And one of the problems that we're seeing is that, again, there's this huge misunderstanding of what ethnic studies is. People think that it's the study of different ethnic groups. So they're like, okay, that's fine. They don't understand that the ideology is inherently political, and that it relies on this binary that is very rigid and very narrow. In California, what happened is ethnic studies activists first pushed through that requirement for it to be a graduation requirement, got that made into law. And now they're using that to justify them coming into K-12 schools and providing teacher professional development and curriculum development. And what they're bringing into the classroom with those resources are things that are highly anti-American, anti-liberal, and we're seeing, of course, the fingers of anti-Semitism and anti-Blackness come in as well. So when we think of, well, who are those people that are involved? Well, many of them are ethnic studies academics that were part of ethnic studies departments or other studies departments in higher education. They formed a lot of little different groups. There's a huge coalition, the Coalition for Liberated Ethnic Studies. It's comprised of roughly 32, 33 different organizations. They come into schools, again, provide teacher training, provide curriculum development, and they're using the ethnic studies mandate to do that. So a school district, a school board, a superintendent will sign a contract with these groups to come into the school and provide this type of training or curriculum development in the school. We saw an example of something similar in Hayward Unified when the organization Woke Kindergarten was paid $250,000 to come in and do some of this work in a school. Ultimately, it failed horrifically. Kids suffered, learning loss increased, which isn't a surprise because the pedagogy is not based on anything scholarly. It's simply ideology.
And I just want to jump in with Brandy. This is a huge problem in California, but it's not just happening in California. It's spreading across the United States. So we're seeing it in Minnesota recently. We're seeing it in Texas, in Massachusetts, and elsewhere. And as Brandy was saying, it's these activists sort of push for these. And what happened with the California curriculum is that there was a lot of back and forth about, well, can we take out elements of the ethnic studies curriculum that we find to be controversial or that other groups are unhappy with? So, for example, the Jewish community was unhappy with the original draft of the ethnic studies curriculum. But not only the Jewish community, there were other communities who also found it to be a problem. And so there's this back and forth about, well, let's take out some things, let's try and make it more palatable. But if you actually go and look at the state sort of stamped ethnic studies curriculum for California now, there is language in that curriculum that is directly from the Liberated Ethnic Studies Curriculum Consortium that is lifted from their website. You can do a side-by-side comparison. So it's really, really difficult once you let this in the door, and once you let the political ideologues in the door, to extricate them and to try and turn ethnic studies into what Brandy was saying most people think it is in the beginning, which is a sort of, love of different ethnic groups. It's very difficult to do that because the political is baked into what it is. And a great example of this, the Jewish the Jewish Federation in Los Angeles. They were one of these groups that had a problem with the original draft of the ethnic studies curriculum in California and worked to get the curriculum redrafted, remade, so that the anti-Semitism was taken out and perhaps we could have some lessons in there about Jewish community contributions. And they held a webinar recently talking about ethnic studies, talking about this they had won in de-anti-Semitizing it. And in the course of this, they had on activists and representatives for ethnic studies to tell people what ethnic studies was about. And the representatives were very clearly using words like, this is a liberated ethnic studies program. We believe in raising the critical consciousness of students. That is explicitly political. And it would have been great if the moderator had stopped and said, hey, what do you mean by liberated ethnic studies? What do you mean by critical consciousness raising? Because by doing that, then the whole house of cards falls away. Then they have to explain that it's about education. It's about preparing your children to be political activists for a very, very particular ideological point of view. So as much as we can try and say, well, we can reform these, we can take out some of the distasteful elements of it, it's very difficult to do that because the birth of the field, as Brandy says, was born through political activism, not through academia.
You kind of touched on something, Mika, there about they actually openly said this is liberated ethnic studies. We believe in this. But for parents whose kids have to be enrolled in ethnic studies or are, you know, by choice enrolled in ethnic studies, what are some terms? What are some words? How would they know that this is a liberated ethnic studies or the, you know, kind of the bad kind of ethnic studies versus, you know, what Brandy mentioned at the very beginning? I mean, ethnic studies in and of itself is not bad per se. So what makes it liberated? What words, slogans, phrases should we be on the lookout for?
Right. Well, firstly, the word liberated, because by that they mean liberated from the hegemonic, you know, heteropatriarchal white supremacist system that we're living in. Critical consciousness, if they use that should be a red flag, because that doesn't mean to think critically. That doesn't mean to evaluate sources or evidence critically. That means to think about how can I implement what I'm learning in my everyday life? How can I turn this knowledge into activism? If you see things like intersectionality, if you see things like systems of oppression, systemic power, anything that is trying to explain the world through a systemic lens, that would be a problem. Brandy, any other warning words that come to your mind?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard because a lot of the words that they use, just like ethnic studies, sound innocuous. But when you hear, right. I think that you listed great ones. I think that I would, obviously, if you hear words about oppression or oppressor or oppressed, it's a pretty good indicator that it's an ethnic studies curriculum that's really focused on political ideology, not scholarship.
So, Brandy, you had mentioned that a lot of these liberated ethnic studies groups go in and actually teach the teacher training. Is there, again, can we identify the group? So if we know that ethnic studies is in our school, can we look down and go, okay, this is being taught by X, Y, and Z, and therefore it is liberated? Is there that kind of notification?
Yes. So there's a group, XITO, it's XITO. They're in multiple school districts, again, not just in California. They do teacher training. They've done some in Colorado, Washington State, I think possibly Michigan. They're one. Liberated Ethnic Studies Model Curriculum Consortium is another one. There's an organization that, there are also organizations that come in and do this same type of thing where they're bringing this ideology and these illiberal resources into K-12 schools through other means. One is through what they call culturally responsive education. So there are multiple groups that do that. One is PEP, P-E-P. I can't remember exactly what the acronym stands for, but there are a lot of Cal States and UC departments of education and ethnic studies departments that have partnered together with these activist organizations to offer things like online or in-person short certificate programs to certify ethnic studies teachers. And I think that's another thing that we should highlight and pay attention to. The study of ethnic groups happens in social studies. It happens in classes like anthropology. This discipline, ethnic studies in itself, is not that. So what's happened is you have a lot of these activist groups partnering with certain Cal States and certain UC ethnic studies departments, schools of education, departments of education to offer these ethnic studies certificates. And what they're doing then is trying to take ethnic studies, the requirement, out from under the history and social studies framework. The history and social studies framework in and of itself prevents bringing in of political ideology into the classroom. Ethnic studies activists, obviously, their whole point is to bring in political ideology into the classroom. So they don't want the class under a history and social studies framework.
And they say this quite openly. There's an academic at UC Riverside who says, you know, the idea of ethnic studies as being a study of multiculturalism is bland and watered down. And what it actually is a critical analysis of the way that power works in society. Right. So when you hear ethnic studies, that's what it's about. It's about getting your children and your students to understand the world through a very, very specific leftist lens and not considering any other points of view about how the world might work or how history might have moved or changed.
This sounds so much like, I know what we've been seeing with teacher training. A lot of it the kind of the Bible, if you will, of teacher training is Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed. So it sounds like they basically took this book and modeled this class specifically on that. Would that be a correct statement?
I think that's yes. I think that's pretty much what's happening. I mean, so when you think about critical consciousness, that's exactly what Pedagogy of the Oppressed is about. How do we turn an everyday lesson into a possibility for political consciousness raising, right? And so that's what the entire ethnic studies curriculum field is about. It's about raising your child's political consciousness and turning them into activists. And another danger with this is, yes, we have these groups that go in and offer trainings. You also have these groups give out sort of free curriculum, free lesson plans. So if you go after this webinar to the Liberated Ethnic Studies Model Curriculum Consortium, you will see, it's quite a mouthful, but if you go there, you will find on their website a whole bunch of lesson plans to go for teachers to just plug right into their classes. And if you're a teacher and you're busy, that's great. So you don't have to think that, you don't have to think about, these are experts in the field, they're telling me this is good, I'm going to use it. And that's a problem. So the fact that ethnic studies is starting to be mandated everywhere, but exactly which curriculum you should use is sort of being left up to teachers, gives these activists more wiggle room to enter the classroom in ways that would be harder for us to have oversight over.
And I think just to add one thing to that, another reason that that's happening is because there really isn't a lot of guidance coming from the people that have decided to make this a graduation requirement. So there have been some letters, there have been some guardrails put in place, but there hasn't yet been an answer, at least in the state of California, as to who is actually responsible for enforcing those guardrails. So if my kid is at class and their teacher's teaching them something that explicitly violates the guardrails that were put in place to prevent things like anti-Semitism and bigotry and discrimination from coming into the class, who as a parent, who am I supposed to report that to? That question has been posed over and over to multiple people who have decision-making authority in the state of California, including the state superintendent of education, and there's been no answer.
So let me make sure I understand you correctly, particularly in California, where this is becoming a mandated course. The teachers themselves, is it by the school district, or the teachers themselves, they just say, yeah, I've got this course, and they pick up whatever curriculum they want to use?
So correct me if I'm wrong, I think the school district can say this is a recommended curriculum, but I think teachers have some leeway to play with it, to chop and change, right? So
and that's where we've seen teachers bring in material that explicitly violate the guardrails and some of the legislation that mandated ethnic studies. So teachers will bring things from TikTok videos to anything that they found on YouTube, incorporate that into a lesson. And that material that they brought in, we saw it in a school in Sequoia Union School District, where a teacher brought in material that explicitly violated AB 101, which is the bill in California that made ethnic studies graduation requirement, and was teaching it to multiple classes for months. And no one would know if a student didn't tell their parent, hey, this is what we were taught, this doesn't sound right. And that's actually what we're seeing a lot of, kids sitting in class being indoctrinated with this ideology. And if something doesn't feel right, or they have a question, then maybe they tell a parent, and then a parent is like, wait a minute, and reaches out to our organization, JLV, or some other organizations to get a little bit of guidance on how to proceed. But the district, what happens at the district levels, the district determines when they're going to make start rolling out the ethnic studies classes to meet the requirement. And the district signs the contracts with these activist organizations that are worth, hundreds of thousands of taxpayer dollars to come in and provide professional development to teachers and educators, and to come in and give guidance and curriculum. One of the ones that we saw actually was a little more public in May at the hearing with those three superintendents. The superintendent of Berkeley Unified openly admitted that one of Berkeley's thought partners is Liberated Ethnic Studies, which is a group that wrote the initial draft of the ESMC, which was banned, and we were told it would never see the light of day. They're actively working with Berkeley Unified School District to develop their ethnic studies curriculum.
And I just want to sort of a subterranean point here, but there's the onus is put therefore so much on parents and on an individual kid who happens to feel uncomfortable in the classroom. And that's a terrible burden to bear both for parents and for children, right? So there's a double cost to this going on.
Brandy, you had mentioned the Sequoia, the recent incident in Sequoia. Can you give, just so parents know what to ask, like, you know, did you see this in your class, or is this I mean, what exactly happened? And beyond that question, any other specific details of, you know, where it's showing up as anti-Black, anti-Semitic, you know, what are kind of some of the specifics that are making this liberated ethnic studies so noxious?
Well, I mean, one of the most common things that we're seeing, especially since October 7th, is ethnic studies. The ethnic studies requirement is being used to teach anti-Israel, Jew-hating material. So the class in Sequoia Union, the teachers that developed this lesson brought in materials from one sworn enemy country of Israel, Turkey, which operates the channel on YouTube and makes completely historically inaccurate videos lying about the history of not just the country Israel, but also lying about the history of the Jewish people as a people, and brought in things like that into this lesson. Now, this lesson was framed as dominant and counter narratives. And it was really, and again, that's the oppressor versus oppressed binary. It was painting a picture that these people who have real or perceived success are dominant because of that real or perceived success. And in order to have achieved that success, they've exploited or discriminated or stepped on this other group of people that we should actually now uplift so they can provide the counter narrative. This lesson was taught, I mean, it was taught for a long time to multiple classes. The district was engaged by parents who were extremely courageous in speaking up. However, the district also didn't address the issue as far as how do you correct these kids that have been indoctrinated for weeks and weeks and weeks? How do you correct that? How do you admit or reteach or let them know that that was misinformation, that that was incorrect, that that was discriminatory? And so the reteaching of those lies didn't happen, at least still, as far as I know, that still has not occurred. And we're talking about something that happened, I don't know, 9-10 months ago.
So on that note, though, if you know that your child is going to have to take this ethnic studies, are there good ethnic studies curricula out there? I mean, if teachers do have this kind of leeway, could parents come and say, hey, here's this one, have a look at that? Are there even any alternatives out there that are worth considering? I know that perhaps even ethnic studies in some way, shape, or form, we might even want to do away with and just put it as part of social studies or history, or just have more classes. Brandon, you and I have talked before about more classes like dance, Latin American dance, or something like that would be an ethnic studies acceptable class versus this just liberated ethnic studies curriculum as it is now. Is there any suggestions or alternatives that parents could say, hey, this could go as the ethnic studies? If we have to do it.
So it is true. I mean, it's worth doing while it's mandatory, right? So now that it's mandatory for you to take an ethnic studies in California, then yes, there are organizations that are developing alternative ethnic studies curricula and hopefully making those available to teachers that can be used and that should be pushed to school districts and that parents and teachers alike should be on the lookout for.
Brandy, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I think also we can look at, there are certain school districts that have provided what they provided classes that meet the ethnic studies mandate even before this ever came into the picture. So there are school districts that have offered, you know, African American history courses and the Chinese American experience, like social studies classes and Chicano literature. These have existed for a long time. It's not like this is something that's new or newly needed, how the activists have really tried to push this. So there was this taking advantage of a moment in recent American history where you kept hearing that we need to do this because it's urgent. There's this sense of urgency. We urgently need ethnic studies, as though it was going to be the easy button cure-all for everything that all of the ills that plague K-12 education. That just honestly isn't the case. There was an idea that, well, kids have to see themselves in curricula. Not that I would ever argue for diversifying curricula materials that kids have access to, but part of learning also means that you can see yourself in somebody who doesn't look like you or may not have grown up like you, because that's kind of the core part of getting to understanding and learning in humanity. And ethnic studies as a field and as a discipline does the opposite. It pushes this idea that the only people that I can look up to or will truly understand me have to look like me and have come from the exact same background as me, which flattens people, and it also divides people. To the idea that you can never learn from somebody who comes from a different background than you or has different thoughts than you is something that's kind of being set aside and brushed away with this discipline.
Absolutely, it balkanizes people into separate groups, and I mean, anyone who's done, you know, any sort of rudimentary social studies, political science class knows that by raising an ethnic consciousness in that kind of way, to say that you can only rarely understand your in-group members, you're not going to feel warmth towards an out-group member. It's going to raise conflict. It's not going to bring together unity or some sort of form of understanding, which is what they say it will do.
Brittany, can you go back, and you said, you know, there was a moment in time where the urgency was really, you know, kind of spilled over. Tell us a little bit more about what led us to that moment in time where ethnic studies became such a hot topic that we needed to mandate it for our schools.
Well, this happened when ethnic studies originally sprung up in the 60s, and Third World Liberation Front across universities, starting in the Bay Area in California and spreading across the country. And at that time, what we saw is the development of a lot of studies departments. So Black studies, Chicano studies, Asian studies, they popped up, and those departments were inherently political. Again, there was they were very low on the scholarship and really high on the ideology, as far as being able to explain away the experiences of, say, Black Americans only through race. And what we saw recently, in more recent years, probably the past 10, maybe 15 years, is a lot of activist organizations, just community activist organizations, got a lot more politically divisive. And so we saw with the rise of organizations and groups like Black Lives Matter and the movement for Black Lives, when those groups started popping up, the Me Too movement, we saw that kind of seep in a little bit into education, where schools became, instead of places for learning, places for activism. So there was this idea, well, we have to do something. We have to do it urgently to solve the social ills. I understand, obviously, wanting to be proactive and addressing anything as horrific as any type of violence against any ethnic group, any racial group, and any person or group of people that may seem or be under attack. However, that activism seeping into what should have been or used to be spaces of learning is where we started to see it's urgent, it's urgent, it's urgent. Like, we have to raise the kids to be the child army to fight the social ills that adults should be managing. And I feel like that's exactly where we're in right now. You have these activist organizations that are in schools indoctrinating kids every day, like those kids will be their child soldiers in this ideological war.
So The other thing that I've noticed with ethnic studies is it really highlights only certain groups. So, the idea behind ethnic studies is, all ethnicities are good. I'm assuming like the good form of ethnic studies is like, let's look at these other cultures that make up America. Let's learn a little bit more about them. But really, a lot of the ethnic studies only focuses on certain minority groups. Can you discuss that a little bit? Am I right? And if so, can you just, kind of flesh that out a little bit more?
You are right. There's sort of there's the 4 core groups, or the 4 core disciplines, which is American, Black American, Chicano, Latino, and I'm forgetting the last one. But so, but as you say, going to ignore a whole swath of the popular, or maybe Arab American heritage, I think, and maybe Jews if we're lucky. So I think that, it ignores Irish Americans, it ignores German Americans, but it also ignores Americans who come from different, we're going to look at Asian Americans, but we're really only looking at Chinese Americans, Japanese Americans, and Korean Americans. What about all the myriad other people from other different Asian countries, right? This is the problem with it. You can't, eventually, it gets to a point of sort of ridiculousness, where you have to keep extrapolating out so that every single society can be represented, and it's just not possible. So in the end, they do, in a way, construct their own hierarchy of identity, which is something that they're trying against by only looking at these core groups. It's just another one of the contradictions that exists within ethnic studies.
Brandy, any other ideas on these groups?
I find it interesting. One of the timing now to try to kind of revisit the 1960s activist era by a lot of these so-called scholar activists would be funny if it wasn't so damaging, only because the population of California, the demographic has shifted so drastically from what it was in the 60s. So you have one of the fastest growing student demographics aren't students of color solely, it's students who are multi-ethnic. So there were a lot of parents at these school board meetings who've talked about it, like, well, where does my kid fit? They don't fit in these boxes anymore. This is 2024. The student population does not look like it did in 1968. So the whole reason for ethnic studies to be developed in the 60s, if you agree with it, and I'm not saying that I do, doesn't exist in the same context as it does today. And that's actually one of the reasons I think there's been so much confusion over what to do now. So you have school districts in the early drafts of ethnic studies, Indian, Hindu Americans were not included as a group, neither were Koreans. Well, if you look at places like California, California has the largest Hindu population in the country. So you have schools and school districts that have a significant proportion of their student body that are Hindu American. So if the idea was we need ethnic studies so our kids can see themselves in curricula, well, you've just erased them. And the study of different ethnic groups is already embedded in something called social studies.
Right.
And this is, well, there's 2 things I want to bring up. Firstly, this idea of the population doesn't look like it did in the 60s, right? So you have these situations where kids are put in a position where a teacher is saying to them, let's say that there was one anecdotal story of a student who was half black, half white, and this teacher was telling him, well, you're white dominant. You need to be in the white affinity group, which is when they put students into groups based on their ethnicity or color, or you're not really allowed to contribute to this portion of the class. And the teacher was putting that identity on him. So the more that we start to see ourselves simply in terms of identity, the more divisive and ugly it gets. But the other point is this interdisciplinary nature of ethnic studies. As Brandy says, a lot of these issues, they're already spoken about in social studies. And ethnic studies says we are more than history, we are more than English, we are more than social studies. We take all of those elements when we put together our ethnic studies curriculum. But if you do that, you dilute any sort of academic or rigorous purpose to it. So the point is, we're going to take from history, we're going to take from English, we're going to take from social studies to construct a class which has a particular political point of view that we want to get across. we're not teaching our students a discipline or how to think in that discipline or how to study that discipline. We're using that discipline for our own ends. And this is something that I saw and many ex-academics have seen happen throughout academia, where a discipline gets watered down or diluted by interdisciplinary studies or by sort of activist takeovers. And this is what is now happening in K through 12 through curricula like this. And it's deeply troubling because it lowers the academic standard.
Speaking of lowering the academic standard, you'd mentioned, Brandy, at the very beginning about grade slipping, because this is and Mika, you'd mentioned too, because this is more of a political activist agenda, we're seeing actually grades slipping. And I wonder if you can kind of speak to that a little bit more. I mean, it doesn't have to be specific to ethnic studies, but I mean, to the extent that there is some overlap with what we see in actually grades happening right now. What is your feedback with that?
It's kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy. So if you say, well, Black students will do less well academically because the schooling system is inherently racist, and then while Black students are in school, you spend less time teaching them to read and compute, and so they do less well in reading and mathematics. And then you say, well, that's because schooling is inherently racist. So there's this cycle. Any parent knows, any teacher knows who spent the time to teach a kid how to do a new skill, how to read, that in order for them to grasp that concept, like teaching a child almost anything, you need repetition and you need a certain amount of time. And that's almost anyone. Like if you're going to learn to play an instrument, play the piano, if you're going to learn to dance, if you're going to learn to drive, anyone who's ever, risked their lives teaching their teenager to drive, they need practice. So a school hour is 7.5, 8 hours. Imagine now that you have less of that time in the classroom actually learning those skills. Academic outcomes will suffer. There's only so many hours in the day. There's only so many hours a kid is in the classroom. So in order for a student to learn, now that time is being taken away for them to do these other activities or be indoctrinated with this other ideology. So telling your Black student, well, the deck is stacked against you. We live in a white supremacist society. Everything is set up for you to fail. And that's what you're spending your time telling them as an educator to a student. Where is the one why would they try to succeed, to learn, to achieve? If they think that the deck's stacked against them anyway, what's the point? And then how would they even be able to if the teacher, the educator, is failing in their basic duty to give that student the skills and tools that she needs to learn?
So this seems like in some ways an outgrowth of the DEI movement. I mean, I know that you'd mentioned these studies had started in the 60s to kind of get into the K through 12 space, but it sounds like this kind of piggybacked on when you talked about the urgency of the DEI movement, and this was the response to how we could put that in or insert that into a classroom in a academic way. Is there any legitimacy to that thinking?
I think so, but I think you see it in other, school disciplines as well. So, you have math classes now, which are now tilted towards social justice learning rather than, just plain old mathematics. And you have science or history or English. So I think it's definitely a part of the story, but not the only way that we're seeing DEI in the classroom.
So then let's go back history-wise again. You had mentioned that this, in the 60s, this kind of started with the Third World Liberation Front, these as one of the groups that was promoting these ideas. And then, Brandy, you'd given us, and I put in the notes, some of the groups that are now pushing the Liberated Ethnic Studies, SHITO, Liberated Ethnic Studies Model Curriculum Consortium. What is there, and I know a little bit about SHITO, but I find this interesting, and if you can give some more insight to our audience. I mean, what is their particular objective? Why are they, as a group, involved in K through 12 education, specifically through ethnic studies, but also, Mika, as you mentioned, it's kind of spreading everywhere. But what is most of these groups people haven't even heard of. I'm guessing Shido might be something that someone might have heard of, the Third World Liberation Front, but these other smaller groups that are kind of breakoffs of the Third World Liberation Front, people know nothing about them. So what is their overall objective? What are they trying to get done?
I mean, I think that, and Mika, I'm going to be interested to hear your take, given your academic background, your PhD, and what you think this is. So part of me, the cynical side, is like, I mean, they're in it for a quick buck. They're making a good, like a pretty penny. So as much as they may be neo-Marxists, they're enjoying the fruits of capitalism. I think the other part is that some of these individuals and some of these organizations, I think, are true believers. I think they truly want to tear at the fabric of Western liberal democracy so that they can prop up some dream of some type of communist or Marxist utopia. I mean, that's the cynical side. And groups like Shido say it. I mean, they put on teacher training from Turtle Island to Palestine, and they talk about dismantling the United States of America and establishing Azatlan from all the way from the southernmost part of Mexico to the Canadian border. So there are some true believers in this. I don't think that we should just laugh them off because it sounds so ridiculous, because I do think that there are some true believers. And I also think there's some people that see, oh, it's a good way to make a name for myself and to kind of establish myself in this profession and make some money while I'm doing it. But Mika, this is your expertise.
I mean, I agree that there are some grifters, but I think that a lot of it is driven by these true believers. And I think it was the Massachusetts Teachers Union webinar on anti-racism, where one of them said, "Well, here we are in the so-called United States," just tripped off the tongue. They believe this stuff, and they see it as a project and as their life's work to undo the capitalist, patriarchal, white supremacist society that we all live in, this oppressive, terrible society that we all live in, that lets them work in Ivy League towers and then drive nice cars. So I having been around enough of them, I think that they are true believers, and I think therefore they are truly dangerous. And the tricky part is saying that out loud makes you, the person saying these people are true believers and they really do want to dismantle the structures that we all live in, it makes you sound like a conspiracy theorist, cuckoo person. And so it's very difficult to get that point across. Mm-hmm. And so the only way to do it is to actually show the materials. Mm-hmm. Go to the Liberated Ethnic Studies Model Curriculum Consortium website. They talk about critical consciousness. And then do some of your own research and see what critical consciousness means. They're hiding the ball, but they're not hiding the ball that well, right? It's out there for you to see, and it's kind of shocking to me. When I was first digging into the California curriculum scandal, I just thought, did no one in state government go to their website and just have a glance? Just have a glance at what these people are saying before they just jumped on board. We could have avoided a whole bunch of trouble if anyone had just done that, but it's important. It's incumbent on us to know what they're saying and know what they're doing so that we can fight back against it.
And I'll put in the YouTube and in our X, where this is streaming live, we all got together and did a report on ethnic studies in California. So I'll have a link to that report, because it actually does. The report is nice in that it actually shows some of the images that, if you were to look, you would see, if you look at the names, the people are leaders of these groups like the Shido and whatnot, and actually did a little, 5 minutes of research, you could see very easily what they were supporting. One of the things, and I'm not sure if it was Shido, that surprised me when I did the cursory search that I did, was one of the groups. It was a I guess more of a Mexican, nationalist group who thought that California actually was supposed to be part of Mexico. And so part of their agenda was almost, ironically, power. It was almost to take that part of Texas and California and make it into Mexico as, the United States being an oppressor. So, but it was just a trading of power. It was just another power play.
Yeah.
I catch that right? I mean, or did I make that up in my head?
No, and I think it's GITO that's holding a sort of a land back training. I don't know if they've already done it or if it's coming up soon. You know, they mean what they say. They mean what they say.
I think I'm sorry, Mika.
No, I'm done.
The concerning, another concerning part to me, one that's actually highly concerning, is that these activists and their organizations are getting a foothold because of the institutional support they have. Yeah. So UC Santa Cruz, the University of California, Santa Cruz, has a Department of Ethnic Studies that is just chock full of liberated ethnic studies activists. That's all that they promote. That's what their department is for. And the ethnic studies graduation requirement is a jobs program for every ethnic studies department at every Cal State University and every UC.
Interesting.
Yeah. It's the long march through the institutions. You know, we're not at the beginning of the march anymore.
Right.
That's the problem.
But we're behind the curve.
Very much so.
Mm.
Very much so.
Let's end on that too.
On that hopeful note.
Well, the hopeful note is that we are actually, you and Brandy, by the way, are actually creating alternative curricula that will be rolled out soon, and so that is something that is good. But a lot of times this word neo-Marxism gets kind of thrown around a bit, and I think we've seen from the groups, again, if you just do the research on the groups that created these curricula, you will see, I mean, most of them actually openly say that they are neo-Marxist. So there's, like you said, Mika, they're kind of hiding in plain sight to the extent that they're hiding it off. You just do a little bit of your research there. But can you give some specific examples of where you would classify this as part of that neo-Marxist long march through the institutions? What aspects of both ethnic studies, but also this movement in general around the pedagogy of the oppressed, what makes that neo-Marxist? How can people point to something and go, this is where, I can look at this and say that this is neo-Marxist, and bring that to the teacher's attention, bring that to the administrator's attention? Is there anything there that people could look for?
So you mean in terms of terminology?
Or even anything, because a lot of times, again, a lot of this is hidden in plain sight, but you have to know what you're looking for.
So again, I think I've said it a few times, but if you see critical consciousness, that's neo-Marxist, right? That's about, now it's not about class consciousness, it's a different type of consciousness, but we want you to understand what your role is in the pecking order of this white supremacist system, and to unify with your brothers and against it, right? So that's about turning your scholars and your students into activists by raising their critical consciousness. If you see, again, the word liberated, if you see social emotional learning, we haven't spoken about that too much today, and it's a lot to get into, but that's a terminology that would set off alarm bells in my head as well. That's also linked to these ideas that were put forward by Freire and then taken forward. Yeah.
So this term critical, oh, sorry, Brady, I mean, but maybe this will go with what you're about to say. This term critical, I think a lot of people, again, don't recognize it as how it's being met. And critical often in neo-Marxist terminology is that kind of classification system. And whereas we're thinking critical thinking, think about it a little bit more. So that's really, I think that's really key.
Yeah. So Brady, did you want to jump in?
No, go ahead.
Okay. So when you see critical used by these kind of actors, they're not thinking about, how do I evaluate something critically in terms of how do I think about the sources that I'm reading here and the evidence that they give me, and how do I weigh that up? When they talk about critical, what they're saying is, think about the dominant narrative or the dominant agenda here, and then problematize it and critique it and undermine it. So in my discipline, political science, there's just so much that I love that has been problematized and criticized, and everything is now critical IR or international relations or critical women. So whenever you see critical, what they're doing is they're undermining the dominant, what they see as the dominant narrative, to try and subvert it.
Yeah, I think that one indicator is also what is not included, what isn't happening.
Yeah.
So I'm a firm believer in academic rigor and scholarship. And if you notice that kids actually aren't really learning anything that you would think that they should be learning in school, there's it's a good indicator that the school or the class is pushing more ideology than academics. And we miss that a little bit, especially now, because a lot of learning loss gets put kind of blamed on COVID and school closures and Zoom school. But we could see the academic outcomes actually falling before COVID, as we saw an increase in ideology coming in and replacing scholarship in the classroom.
So before I let you all go, we have got, I'm going to plug our liberalism and practice panel discussion, which is on Thursday, same time, also, but on our circle page, the IL Values circle page. Brandy is going to be hosting that, and it's on grading or not degrading. And I think that there's some overlap here on what we're talking about. I feel like, Brandy, you were talking about how, as kids, as we focus less on educating and we focus more on activism, we see grades failing. But then what we've been doing to push up is everyone gets an A. Everyone gets an A. So a lot of questions that kind of overlap with what we're talking about here. So join us for that. And you can find out more on our website, ilvalues.org, and more about Brandy. If you want to dig into Brandy and Mika, you can find out more about what they're doing at jilv.org. Thank you both so much for your time and for giving us this overview of ethnic studies as we head back into the classroom.
Thank you.
Thank you.